The fluorescent light above Triage Bay 2 had been flickering for 11 days. Yvonne Marchetti had filed the maintenance request twice. Nobody fixed it. That was Harlow General in a sentence. She was standing beneath it, that broken light stuttering overhead, when the charge nurse called her name with a particular flatness that meant this wasn't about a patient. Marchetti, Director Willett wants you upstairs. Yvonne didn't look up from the chart she was finishing. She'd learned a long time ago that looking up too fast gave people the impression you were afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was tired, which is a different thing entirely, though in places like Harlow General, people tended to confuse the two. She'd been working this ER for 7 months. 7 months of night shifts in a hospital that sat on the eastern edge of Drumheller, Alberta, like something the city had built and then forgotten, all gray concrete and peeling vinyl flooring, and a parking lot that flooded every spring. The kind of hospital where the 3rd floor had new carpeting and the emergency department had a coffee machine that hadn't worked since February. Yvonne was 33 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a tight braid, the kind that pulled at her temples and gave her headaches by hour 6 of a 12-hour shift. Her scrubs were always clean. Her stethoscope was always around her neck. She moved through the ER with an efficiency that some of the staff found unsettling, not rushed, just precise, the way someone moves when they've worked in conditions where wasted motion gets people killed. She'd been that kind of person for a long time. Before Harlow General, before Drumheller, before she'd spent years trying to become someone who didn't know that about herself. Charge Nurse Boulanger was watching her from behind the desk, with the expression she always wore when something unpleasant was happening, and she was glad it wasn't happening to her. 44, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who'd survived a decade in a failing ER by learning which way the wind blew and standing accordingly. Marchetti, he's waiting. Yvonne capped her pen, set the chart in the rack, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Director Gilles Willet's office smelled like the aftershave he wore too much of, and the ambition he'd had too little of for too long. He was 58, silver-haired, with the soft hands of a man who hadn't treated a patient in 20 years, and the confident posture of someone who'd forgotten that fact. Behind him, through the window, Drumheller's skyline looked small and gray under an October sky. Boulanger had followed her up. She stood near the door with her arms crossed, which told Yvonne everything about how this meeting had been organized. Nurse Marchetti, Willett said. Sit down. She didn't sit. She'd learned that too. We've received a formal complaint from Dr. Arsenault regarding your conduct during last Thursday's overnight. He means the restraints, Yvonne said. Willett's jaw tightened. Dr. Arsenault is the attending physician on that ward. You don't override his orders. His orders were wrong. The patient had an acute reaction. She was pulling out her IV. She wasn't agitated. She was hypoglycemic and confused. Restraining her was going to make it worse. That determination is not yours to make. It was the right call. That is not the point. And there it was. Yvonne had heard that sentence in slightly different forms for 7 months. Not the point, not your place, not helpful. The language of institutions that had decided process mattered more than outcomes. This is your 3rd documented incident in 8 weeks, Willett continued. Incident reports, complaints. Boulanger's had to manage 2 separate staff meetings because of disruptions you've caused. I filed those reports because patients were at risk. The medication error in Bay 4 last month that could have killed someone. Those reports made this department look negligent. Those reports documented negligence that was already happening. The room went quiet. Boulanger's expression had gone carefully neutral. Willett's had not. I've discussed this with HR, he said finally. We're terminating your employment, effective tonight. Collect your personal items and turn in your badge at the security desk. Yvonne looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she'd documented in 7 months. The staffing ratios, the equipment deferrals, the way certain incident reports disappeared before they reached anyone with authority to act on them. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Willett leaned back in his chair. Is that a threat? No, just an observation. She walked out. The elevator ride down was silent. She cleaned out her locker in 4 minutes. She'd never unpacked much, and handed her badge to the security guard at the desk, a young man named Fournier who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She walked through the ER one last time, past the flickering light, past the coffee machine that still didn't work, out through the ambulance bay doors and into the October cold. Her car was parked in the far lot under a light that had burned out in September. A 9-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that worked well enough unless the temperature dropped below -10, which in Alberta meant it worked until approximately November and then didn't. She was 20 feet from it when she heard them. The sound was specific. Anyone who'd spent time in certain places would have recognized it. The low, coordinated growl of heavy vehicles moving fast and purposeful, not the stop and start of civilian traffic. She turned. 3 dark SUVs came around the east corner of the lot in tight formation, headlights cutting through the October dark. Behind them, a military transport vehicle. The kind she hadn't seen parked outside a civilian hospital since her second tour. She stopped walking. Every part of her that she'd spent 3 years trying to quiet went still and alert at the same time. The vehicles pulled up to the ambulance bay in a practiced sweep. Doors opened. Men and women in tactical gear moved with the kind of coordination that came from doing this exact thing, under worse conditions, more times than anyone had bothered counting. A stretcher came out of the transport vehicle. On it, a figure in blood-soaked kit, oxygen mask already in place. Yvonne started walking back toward the hospital before she decided to. She had no badge, no authority, no reason to be here. The practical part of her brain noted all 3 of these facts and filed them away for later consideration, because the rest of her brain had registered something else entirely. The way the operators were moving, the way one of them kept close to the stretcher, hand not quite touching the patient's arm. The particular tension in a group of people who were trained not to show tension and were showing it anyway. She knew what that meant. She'd seen it before in other places, in other contexts, when someone on that stretcher was someone who mattered. The ER doors burst open as the team came through. She heard Boulanger's voice rising, heard Dr. Arsenault demanding to know who'd authorized this, heard the crash cart being called. She followed them in. Standing in the ambulance bay entrance in civilian clothes, no badge, 7 minutes after being escorted out of the building, Yvonne assessed the situation through the glass doors with the same calm she'd applied to worse ones. The patient was in trouble, real trouble. His pressure was tanking. She could see it in the monitor from here, could read the readout as clearly as if she were standing beside it. Arsenault was shouting about protocol. 2 nurses were looking at each other the way people look at each other when they don't know what to do and are hoping someone else does. She pushed through the doors. Boulanger saw her first. What the hell? His pressure's critical. Yvonne moved past her toward the bay. He's bleeding somewhere you can't see from outside. Left side. You don't work here. Then nobody fires me twice. She reached the stretcher. The patient was male, mid-40s, field dressings over his torso, the kind of packing that field medics did when they were buying time and knew it. His color was wrong. His breathing was wrong. The monitor agreed with her on all counts. Arsenault stepped in front of her. Get out of this bay right now. Call surgery. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the patient. Call them now and tell them to prep for an abdominal bleed, probable splenic involvement. You have 3 minutes before he arrests. I'm the attending, then attend. She met his eyes. Call surgery or pick up a scalpel, but stop standing in the way. The room had gone very still. A woman in a colonel's uniform appeared in the doorway. Tall, late 50s, with the kind of bearing that suggested she'd walked into rooms like this before and found them equally disorganized. The name on her uniform read Beauregard. Her eyes swept the bay and landed on Yvonne. Who is this? Nobody answered immediately. Someone who knows what she's doing, said one of the operators, a staff sergeant with a jaw like a structural support beam. He'd been watching Yvonne's hands. Colonel Beauregard stepped forward. Do what she says. Arsenault stared at her. You can't just do what she says, Beauregard repeated, with the specific calm of someone who never needs to raise their voice now. Arsenault made the call. Yvonne was already moving, adjusting the IV rate, repositioning the monitoring leads, calling out to the nurses in the tone she used when there was no time to explain, and people needed to move. They moved. They'd heard that tone before from other people, apparently, in better circumstances, because they responded to it the way trained staff respond to competence, automatically, gratefully. The patient's pressure stabilized. Not fixed, just stabilized. Enough. The surgical team arrived 4 minutes later. They took one look at the readouts, at the field dressings, at the patient's color, and moved without argument. They were good. Yvonne noticed that the way you notice it when you've worked with people who weren't. She stepped back. The bay slowly returned to its baseline chaos. Boulanger was speaking in a low, furious voice to someone on the phone. Arsenault had gone to stand near the nurse's station with the particular posture of a man replaying a situation he hadn't managed well. Beauregard was watching Yvonne. She walked over. Up close, she had gray eyes and the kind of face that had been weathered by wind and long decisions. 3 rows of service ribbons on her dress jacket. She looked at Yvonne the way people look when they're seeing something they expected to find and found it. You're not staff here? Not anymore, Yvonne said. As of about 30 minutes ago. Beauregard didn't blink. What branch? Army, Medical Corps? Yvonne's voice stayed level. 8 years. 2 tours. The colonel nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they're fitting a piece into a picture they've been assembling for longer than this conversation. Come with me, she said. They sat in a family consultation room off the main corridor, the kind of room with a box of tissues on a low table and chairs arranged in a circle, meant for different conversations than the one they were about to have. Beauregard set her tablet on the table between them without preamble. The man on that stretcher is Major Alain Giroux. She turned the tablet so Yvonne could see. 3rd Canadian Special Operations Regiment, 14 years, 2 tours in Mali, 1 in Latvia, 3 classified operations I'm not going to name in this room. Yvonne looked at the photograph on the screen. Younger, in uniform, squared shoulders, the kind of smile that meant something was funny, and he didn't care who knew it. She'd known that face. Giroux, she said quietly. You know him. It wasn't a question. Yvonne looked up. He was a lieutenant when I knew him. We were in the same forward operating base in 2019. He was wounded in a vehicle incident, and she stopped. I kept him stable until the medevac arrived. Beauregard studied her. He never forgot it. He told the story enough times that when his team flagged Harlow General as a problem 6 months ago, and we needed someone on the inside, his name was one of the first to come in relation to yours. Yvonne felt the floor shift slightly under the conversation. Say that again. Beauregard picked up her tablet. The Canadian Forces Health Services Group has been tracking irregularities at this hospital for 8 months. 3 veterans died here under circumstances that should have been survivable, preventable deaths, all of them papered over in administrative reports. She pulled up a document. We needed someone inside. Someone who would find the problems because they'd look for them. Someone who couldn't be bought or bullied into silence. Someone who'd document everything, Yvonne said flatly. Someone who'd document everything, Beauregard confirmed. And you did. Every incident report you filed came directly to our investigators. You built our case without knowing you were building it. The silence in the small room was the kind that needed a moment to settle. You used me, we placed you. Beauregard's voice didn't apologize, but it wasn't unkind either. You did the rest yourself, because that's who you are. We didn't make you file those reports. We didn't make you catch the medication error or push back on Arsenault or refuse to look the other way when things were wrong. That's your character. We just put it in a room where it would matter. Yvonne sat with that for a moment. Outside, the ER continued its business. She could hear it through the wall. Monitors, voices, the distant closing of a door. What happens now? Beauregard set a folder on the table. Major Giroux is going to survive because you were still in the parking lot when he arrived. Director Ouellette is going to be arrested within the hour. Federal investigators have been in this building for 20 minutes, going through the financial records and the suppressed incident reports and the staffing falsifications. She paused. And you, Nurse Marchetti, are going to stop pretending that the last 8 years of your life didn't happen. The folder had her name on the front. She didn't open it. What's in there? Your service record, said Beauregard. And a job offer. But I'd read them in that order. Well, its arrest happened quietly, the way these things happen in hospitals when the administrators doing the arresting are professionals. No scene in the corridor, no raised voices, just 2 federal investigators appearing at his office door and the sound of his protests fading as they walked him toward the elevator. Boulanger watched it happen from the nurse's station, with an expression Yvonne couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe. Or the particular look of someone calculating rapidly which way the wind had shifted. Yvonne spent the next 2 hours in the surgical waiting area. Beauregard's team had set up a temporary operations point in the corner, laptops and secure lines and the low-focused energy of people working. The operators from Giroux's escort unit sat nearby. They didn't ignore her. They offered her coffee, asked if she needed anything, spoke to her in the shorthand of people who'd been in similar situations and recognized the posture. At 2:40 in the morning, the surgical team came out. He made it, said the surgeon. Splenic rupture, some additional damage we repaired, significant blood loss, but he's stable. He'll be in recovery for a few days. One of the operators exhaled quietly. Beauregard nodded once. Can we see him? Not tonight. In the morning, maybe. The surgeon left. The room resettled. Beauregard looked at Yvonne. Open the folder. Yvonne opened it. The first page was her service record. She hadn't looked at it in 3 years. Awards, commendations, operational reports, a psychiatric evaluation from her discharge process that she remembered being assessed in a room that smelled like industrial soap, answering questions in a voice she'd kept deliberately flat. Beside the service record, a second document, the staff list from a field dressing station in Kandahar province, April 2020. Her name, third from the top. 8 names below hers, a familiar one, Corporal Sasha Nwankwo. 22 years old, posted from Petawawa, who'd arrived at the Phoebe on a Thursday and been wounded 4 days later in the same incident that she'd spent 4 hours managing before the evacuation helicopter arrived. She'd lost her. The corporal had died from a chest wound before they could stabilize her enough to move. Yvonne had spent 3 years carrying that. The second page of the folder was the job offer. Director of Emergency Services, Harlow General Hospital. Full authority over hiring and clinical decisions. Federal Oversight Liaison. Starting salary that made her current nursing wage look like it belonged to a different conversation. I'm a nurse, Yvonne said, not an administrator. You ran a field dressing station in a forward operating position during an active firefight, Beauregard said. You coordinated triage, directed personnel, managed supplies, and made decisions under conditions these administrators have never imagined. She tapped the folder. Don't tell me you can't run an emergency department. That was different. The difference is the noise level. The work is the same. Yvonne looked at the offer letter for a long moment. Then she closed the folder and set it on the table between them. I need to see Giroux first, she said. Then I'll decide. She found him in the morning, in a recovery bay that smelled like antiseptic, and the specific quiet of post-surgical rest. He was awake. He looked like he'd lost an argument with something large and unforgiving, but his eyes were clear, and when she walked in, the left side of his mouth pulled up. Marchetti, he said. His voice was hoarse. Giroux. He exhaled slowly, careful of his bandaging. Told the whole team. Best field medic I ever worked beside. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She didn't know what to say. He filled it. I've been following your postings since you left the army. From a distance. Didn't want to interfere. But when Beauregard's people flagged this hospital and pulled your name as a possible placement, I said yes. He looked at her steadily. I vouched for you. I hope that's all right. Yvonne thought about what to say to that for a moment. Why here? Why this hospital? Because 3 people who wore the same uniform as us died in this building, Marchetti, and nobody was going to do anything about it unless someone like you walked in the door. He paused, and because I know you can't walk past something broken without trying to fix it. Even when it costs you. She didn't answer that directly. She asked instead, why didn't you tell me? Same reason you don't tell a soldier before a mission that the situation is worse than the briefing says. Because you needed to go in clean. You needed to find things because they were wrong, not because you were looking for evidence. If you'd known, he stopped, you'd still have done your job, but it would have felt different. Yvonne thought about 7 months of night shifts, of filing reports that she'd assumed disappeared into administrative nothing, of the night she'd sat in her car in the far lot and thought seriously about requesting a transfer, about starting over somewhere else, about running. She'd stayed because the problems were real and she couldn't make herself pretend they weren't. Take the job, Giroux said quietly. She looked at him. Take it. Build it into something that doesn't kill people. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. You came back in here tonight without a badge, without authority, without a single reason anyone could have given you on paper. You did it because I needed help. He looked at her. That's not something you unlearn. That's who you are. She stayed another 20 minutes. She didn't say much, neither did he. When she left, she took the folder with her. She spent 3 days giving statements to federal investigators, detailed, methodical accounts of every violation she'd documented, every pattern she'd noticed, the way certain reports had vanished and reappeared with alterations. The staffing numbers that didn't match the floor realities, the equipment maintenance logs she'd cross-referenced against actual patient outcomes. The investigators were thorough. They listened. They asked questions that told her they'd already found most of it themselves and were confirming what they had. On the 4th day, she called Beauregard and accepted the position. She walked into the hospital at 6 in the morning on a Monday wearing clean scrubs and her old army boots because she'd worn them every day for 2 tours, and they were the most functional shoes she owned. The security guard at the entrance was a young woman named Talbot who straightened when Yvonne came through the door. Morning, ma'am. Ma'am, not Marchetti, not Hay. Yvonne nodded and kept walking. The ER was starting to stir. She spent the first 2 hours doing the most basic thing she could think of. Walking through it, not reviewing charts, not attending to administrative requests, just looking at the equipment, at the workflow, at the way information moved between people and the places where it got stuck or dropped. The place was worse than she'd understood from the inside. She made lists. She'd always made lists. In the field, lists were the difference between situations that resolved and situations that didn't. Not because lists were magic, but because they forced you to look at the complete problem instead of the loudest part of it. Boulanger found her in the corridor at 8:30. You're actually here, she said. Said I would be. People thought you might not come back after everything. Yvonne looked at her. Why wouldn't I? Because they tried to destroy you. They didn't try hard enough. She paused. I'm going to need to talk to you this afternoon, my office. Boulanger's expression cycled through several things quickly. She settled on something that was neither relief nor dread exactly. Okay, Yvonne spent the rest of the morning in the records. The financial irregularities were significant. Ouellette had been running a billing scheme that specifically targeted Canadian Forces veterans and their supplementary coverage, inflating claims for procedures never performed, medications never administered. Federal prosecutors had the numbers. But there was something else under it, something she hadn't fully understood until she sat with the complete picture. Ouellette hadn't built this alone. She brought it to Beauregard at noon in the family consultation room that had become their de facto meeting point. The pharmacy director, Yvonne said. She set the documents on the table. Dr. Casperson. She's been signing off on medication inventory reports that don't match the floor records. And it's not just sloppiness, the discrepancies are systematic. They follow the same pattern as Let's Billing. Beauregard looked at the documents. How long have you had this? I started noticing it 2 months ago. Filed a report. It came back to me with a notation that it had been reviewed and found to be within acceptable variance. Who reviewed it? Wellett's office. Beauregard set down the document. Right, there's more. Yvonne pulled out another sheet. The 3 veterans who died. I pulled their charts, the complete record, not the summaries in the administrative reports. In 2 of the 3 cases, the medications documented as administered don't match the medications that would have been indicated. The charts say one thing. The pharmacy dispensing records, if you read them carefully enough, say something else. Beauregard was very still. You're saying they were undertreated, Yvonne said, deliberately, not through negligence. Through a deliberate decision to dispense cheaper medications, bill for the higher cost ones, and document the better treatment that didn't happen. The silence in the small was absolute. That's not fraud, Beauregard said finally. No, Yvonne said, it's not just fraud. The arrest of Dr. Casperson happened that afternoon. Federal investigators and provincial health authority officials, no scene, no announcement. The pharmacy staff were informed of an ongoing investigation and asked to preserve all records. 2 of them, Yvonne learned later, had already filed their own internal concerns months ago. Those concerns had been routed to Wellett's office and gone nowhere. The hospital was very quiet that evening. Staff moved through the routines with the specific hush of people processing information they hadn't fully metabolized yet. Yvonne was reviewing staffing proposals at 9 o'clock when Boulanger knocked on the door. She looked worse than she had that morning. Not sick, but the kind of worn down that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. She said, I knew. Yvonne waited. Not about the veterans. Not about Boulanger stopped. I didn't know people died because of it. I want you to know that. But I knew the reports weren't going where I was told they were going. I knew Willett was directing some of them away from the health authority. He told me it was about liability management, that the hospital's legal counsel had advised a different review process. Did you believe him? I wanted to believe him. Boulanger sat down without being asked. It's easier. It's so much easier to accept the explanation that means you don't have to fight anything. Yvonne leaned back in her chair. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're going to find out anyway. She met Yvonne's eyes, and because I've been watching you for 4 days. The way you work, the way you refuse to stop. I've been a nurse for 19 years, and I've been doing it wrong for the last 4, and I know it. What do you want? I don't know. Boulanger's hands were in her lap. I don't know if I deserve anything except to be fired. Probably not, Yvonne said. But I'm going to give you a choice anyway. Boulanger looked up. You tell the investigators everything you know. You work under direct supervision for the next 90 days. You follow every protocol and document every deviation, and you treat every patient in this department like they're the only one who matters. She paused. Or you resign tonight. I'll ensure your exit is quiet, and you spend the rest of your career wherever you end up. Why would you? Because you walked in here and told me the truth when you didn't have to. Yvonne's voice was measured, and because this department needs experienced nurses, and you used to be one. If you're still in there somewhere, I'd rather find out than not. Boulanger sat with that. Then she said, I'll stay. That afternoon, Yvonne drove to the Drumheller Veterans Support Center. It was a low brick building on the north side of the city, fluorescent lit inside, crowded with plastic chairs and pamphlets, and the particular atmosphere of a place doing important work without enough resources to do it properly. She'd called ahead. A counselor named Whitman, 50s, patient eyes, the calm of someone who'd heard a lot of things and chosen not to be shaken by them, met her in a small office. She sat down. She wasn't sure how to start. She'd been sitting with a dead corporal for 3 years and hadn't found the words for it yet. Whitman let the silence be. Then she said, tell me about the person you lost. So Yvonne talked about Nwankwo, about the Thursday she'd arrived, travel-worn and sharp-eyed, fresh from Petawawa, and the way she'd asked good questions from her first day at the FOB, about the morning of the incident. About 4 hours of working in conditions that weren't designed for what she was trying to do, with what she had, and the moment she knew it wasn't going to be enough. About the way she'd spent 3 years doing the math, adding up everything she'd done and subtracting it from the outcome, and the answer always coming out wrong. You've been trying to save enough people, Whitman said quietly. Yvonne looked at her. To make up for the one you couldn't. She said it without judgment. That's a very heavy accounting system. She wasn't wrong. Yvonne drove back to the hospital at dusk. She had 17 messages on her phone. She read 3 of them, replied to 1, and set the rest aside. When she walked back into the ER, it was at the start of a shift change, and staff were arriving in 1s and 2s, and she stood in the corridor for a moment and watched the department wake up. This is what you came back for, she thought. This specific, imperfect, broken, fixable thing. She went to work. The weeks that followed were long and unglamorous in the way that rebuilding things is always unglamorous. New staffing ratios required renegotiating budget allocations with an interim administration that was still finding its footing. Equipment upgrades required documentation that Yvonne produced in the methodical, exhaustive way she did everything, referencing patient outcomes and industry standards and federal healthcare guidelines until the requests were difficult to refuse on their merits. Dr. Arsenault requested a meeting in the second week. He arrived at her office looking like he'd prepared for an argument, and found when he got there that the argument wasn't the shape he'd expected. She told him what she'd told everyone. The protocols existed because patients depended on them, and she expected them to be followed, and she didn't care about hierarchy except as a tool for getting things done. He left without the confrontation he'd prepared for, and after that he was quietly, practically cooperative, the way some people become when they realize the ground has shifted and adjustment is more efficient than resistance. Boulanger proved herself in pieces the way people do. Not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small correct choices. A difficult family conversation handled with unexpected gentleness. A protocol followed when cutting the corner would have been easier. An overnight when a new nurse was struggling, and Boulanger stayed late without being asked. Giroux was discharged from the hospital on a Wednesday, walking under his own power, thinner, moving carefully, with his team around him. He stopped at the ER entrance. Yvonne was behind the desk reviewing charts when he appeared in her sightline. She came around the desk. He held out his hand, and when she took it, he held it for a moment. "Told you," he said. "Told me what? That you couldn't walk past something broken without trying to fix it." He looked around the ER, the new supplies, the reorganized stations, the maintenance requests that had actually been completed, the flickering light in triage bay 2 that had been replaced. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She walked him to the entrance and watched the team load up in their vehicles. Beauregard caught her eye from across the parking lot, gave a single nod. Yvonne nodded back. She went inside. 3 months after that, she received a letter from a woman named Thibodeau in Lévis, Quebec. Her son had been one of the veterans who died at Harlow General. She'd been following the federal investigation in the news and had somehow found Yvonne's name. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten. It said things Yvonne had to stop and put down twice before she could finish reading. It said that knowing what had happened, knowing it was real, knowing it was being addressed, knowing someone had finally refused to look away, made it possible to move forward in a way that nothing else had. It said, "My son served this country with everything he had, and for a long time I thought the country forgot him. You reminded us that someone remembered." Yvonne read the letter 4 times. She wrote back the same day. There were 41 such letters over the following months. She answered everyone. In the spring, Beauregard called to tell her that Ouellet had pled guilty to 7 federal charges. Kasperson, 2 charges. Linked administrators at 2 other regional hospitals had been identified and were under investigation. The Provincial Health Authority had overhauled its veteran patient advocacy protocols and cited Harlow General's restructured department as a model. Yvonne was in the ER when she got that news. She was between patients. She stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at a department that looked nothing like the one she'd walked into 8 months ago. Then a triage alarm went off in Bay 3, and she went. In November, she drove to a small cemetery on the east side of Drumheller where she'd looked up, through the provincial records, the burial site of one of the 3 veterans who died here. A man named Fortin, 53, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and come home and eventually, years later, ended up in the ER at Harlow General with a condition that was survivable and wasn't treated as though it was. She laid flowers. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood in the November cold, the kind that comes off the Badlands flat and serious, and let the silence be what it was. Then she drove back to the hospital. She'd stopped running from herself somewhere in those 8 months. She hadn't noticed it happen. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation of them. Every time she'd held her ground when holding it was harder, every report filed knowing it might go nowhere, every night shift completed, with the same care as the first one, even when the building made that care difficult. You didn't unlearn who you were. You just stopped pretending. She still had a small apartment with boxes she hadn't fully unpacked. She still drove a 9-year-old Subaru. She still made lists and filed maintenance requests and argued with administrators and checked and rechecked medication orders because attention to detail was the difference between outcomes that resolved and outcomes that didn't. But she'd stopped waiting for someone to tell her she was allowed to be here. In December, Giroux sent her a message. Army's establishing a new Veteran Transition Health Liaison program, part of the Canadian Armed Forces Health Services redesign. They're looking for someone to help design the clinical protocols, specifically around emergency care for veterans in civilian hospitals. He added, "They asked me to ask you. I said I'd ask. No pressure." She was sitting in her office when she read it. Through the window, the ear moved below her, the shift evening out into its rhythm. A family in the waiting area, an ambulance in the bay, the light in triage bay 2 working perfectly. She typed back, "Tell them I'm interested." And then she set down her phone and went back to work, because there were charts to review and a department to run and 100 small things that needed attention, and all of it, the ordinary, unglamorous, unrelenting, necessary work of keeping people alive, was exactly where she was supposed to be.